Thank you, everyone, for joining us for our last Compass speaker series of the semester. Today, we welcome Dr. Kelley McClinchey. She is speaking about remapping and retelling the sensuous and emotional geographies of place, implications for tourism. And I always get very excited when we have geographers, fellow geographers on. We pretty much have been having a trend of fellow geographers, but I always get very excited because you guys always talk about things that are so interesting to the study of space and place, as geographers do. So before we begin, as we do for all our events at Ryerson University, we will begin with our land acknowledgement. The land acknowledgement that you see on the screen was created in 2014 and is used uniformly across campus when we begin events. The acknowledgement of the land is a reminder that Canadians are in Indigenous territory. Toronto is in the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. Dish, or sometimes it is called the bowl, represents what is now Southern Ontario. We all eat out of the dish, all of us that share this territory, with only one spoon. That means we have to share the responsibility of ensuring the dish is never empty, which includes taking care of the land and the creatures that we share it with. Importantly, there are no knives at the table, representing that we must keep the peace. And so I just want to remind us that with land acknowledgements, that we are acknowledging the fact that we are guests on this land, and each one of you is potentially sitting in a different area of Indigenous territory. So I encourage you to look that up if you are unsure about the nation upon which you currently sit. So I just want to introduce briefly the Institute for Hospitality and Tourism Research. So thank you so much for coming to our speaker series. When we used to do these speaker series in person, and then when COVID started 2.5 years ago, we switched to online, as much of the world did. And it actually has been really great because we're able to welcome a lot of different speakers from around the world, all of which have been recorded and are posted on our Institute website, which we will put up on in the chat or on the screen if you ever want to catch up on some of our great speakers. So at the Institute for Hospitality and Tourism Research, we're very much a practical-based research organization. And our mission is to facilitate and conduct research of both scholarly value and significance to the tourism and hospitality field. So we try to mobilize knowledge to enhance our research reputation at X University, particularly in the hospitality and tourism field. So as I mentioned, this is one of our Compass speaker series. Other things that we do is also, we have a podcast, which our host Parita has been working on for the last year, where she has been interviewing researchers as well. So please check out our website at htmresearch.ca. So coming on to our lovely speaker, this is Dr. Kelley McClinchey. So Kelley has a PhD in geography and is a contract faculty member at the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies at Wilfrid Laurier University, which is in Waterloo, Ontario, and that's also where I have my PhD from. She is an award-winning researcher and has published several edited book chapters and journal articles on multicultural festivals, mobilities and sense of place, migrant family travel, literary and media narratives, and cultural heritage, placemaking, and social sustainability. Kelley serves on several executive boards for tourism research, such as the Travel and Tourism Research Association Canadian chapter. And also, Kelley serves on several executive boards for tourism research and geography education, promoting the value of tourism research, assisting with the dissemination of geospatial, learning resources, and alongside dedicated colleagues planning national and international conferences. She is interested in the various ways that tourism can provide agency for communities and build resilience. Her current work examines ethnocultural heritage, immigration, and placemaking, and the role of creative industries in rebranding and regenerating tourism. So thank you so much for coming, Kelley. We are thrilled to have you here, and I'm very excited to hear what you're talking about today.
Thank you so much, Sonia, for that wonderful introduction, and welcome to everyone else who's joined us. I'm just sharing my screen here, and I hope everyone can see it okay. Okay, wonderful. All right, so after that wonderful introduction by Sonia, I'm going to get right into my talk today. And rather than focus on sort of one small research project or one project, I want to weave together the work that I've been doing in sort of a narrative story itself and bring to light some of those bigger ideas that have emerged from my research. So I hope you'll follow along on my journey today. And sort of I want to leave off this last speaker series with some maybe big ideas and big thoughts that as an academic, we can kind of grapple with together in the future. So I want to begin today with the big question, where and who are the storytellers? And consider how we may remap our settled spaces and retell some of these stories. We're very good at acknowledging the importance of storytelling in tourism, especially in marketing, and we're very equipped to value these important stories. But I think there's still concern about the legitimacy of some of these stories and the authenticity behind them. And recent research has explored that. While not necessarily part of my research are those Indigenous stories, I do want to bring that in because of our wonderful acknowledgement by Sonia already, and also where I'm situated here in Waterloo in Indigenous territory, that there are multiple ways that we include storytelling. One way in the Indigenous community is to teach values and family histories, significant events and relationships. And we can teach our children these values in gentle and humorous ways, and also highlight the mistakes and antics that have gone on in previous generations, and teach children how to behave, I guess. The other is in creation stories, where we value these significant stories related to Indigenous culture and explain how people have attached themselves to a specific identity and help Indigenous youth to shape their identity based on these stories, as well as learn how to connect ourselves with the land around us and other living beings and so on. So we have acknowledged the importance of stories in tourism, but I think it's still time that we understand how to retell these stories and remap some of these spaces based on our land and our connections in our communities. So I'm going to be continuously talking about this idea of storytelling today in my talk. I also want to bring in something I'm going to be alluding to today, and that's the idea of cultural metaphors in discourse. We've talked about cultural metaphors in tourism research. There is some publications out there that do a really good job on that. And in traditional local cultures, the use of metaphors and proverbs allows us to have a fruitful and engaging conversation and discourse with our local communities. In my discussion today, I'm going to be referring to the cultural metaphor of the unsettled as being pre-colonization and the settled as being post-colonization. I'm also going to be referring to some poetry by Kai Miller and the way that he uses the metaphor, talking about settled as in colonized spaces and unsettled as in pre-colonization. I'm going to be talking about the map maker or the cartographer and using that as a metaphor for the settler or the tourism manager or developer, so to speak. And then talking about this idea of the Rastaman as the local, the person who possesses local knowledge, adapted by Kai Miller, of course. And this idea of paradise as being perhaps during tourism or post-tourism development, and the idea of it not being a paradise as before that. In terms of proverbs, I'm going to bring in this notion of the Yoruba tradition of West Africa, where they talk about a turtle. And the turtle has the secrets of the world on their back. And in these traditional cultures, they use this notion to understand the native and insiders' viewpoints in a local community. And it helps those who are on the outside or outsiders to understand these local communities. So proverbs and metaphors in traditional local communities help understand what's going on. And when we bring that to the context of tourism, I want us to think about how we plan and manage for tourism. And we may want to consider, we do a really good job already, but continue to understand these roles of metaphors and discourse and understand how we plan and manage for tourism in the future. As I mentioned, I'm going to be weaving in some poetry by Kei Miller. I'm going to weave it in because some of his metaphors and some of his words really apply nicely to thinking about tourism and tourism development. I'm just going to be speaking a few excerpts of his poetry. Dr. Miller's writings, use of the metaphor, the map maker, the cartographer, the rastaman, it does a really good job to represent colonizers and colonization, how we think about tourism and how we think about tourism in the future. Dr. Miller does a phenomenal job demonstrating this dialogue between the cartographer and the rastaman or the map maker. And I want to use this to help explain kind of where I situate my research, this retelling and remapping of geographies of place. Dr. Miller, through his own examination of maps in Jamaica, old maps of Jamaica, noticed that on the maps, there would be, say, a plantation house being shown that housed only one family. And yet a nearby village of 300 people was not on the map. Maps hold power. Maps are concrete. And like those in power who determine decision-making and manage and plan for tourism, we have to really engage and re-engage ourselves with who holds the power in making those decisions. So I'd like us to continue thinking about that as I talk today as well. So the first poem that I want to bring in is titled Unsettled by Kei Miller. And he writes, so let us consider an unsettled island. Let us consider a space before colonization or before tourism, before a specific set of belief systems may have come into play. Let's consider this space or place before tourism, perhaps before more destructive forms of mass tourism. Inside this unflattened and unsugared field, as he says, this dengue, the hookworm, the heat and botheration. And he writes, this is no paradise. And yet when the colonizers or the tourism developers come in, we've now created this paradise. Did we? This once unmapped, uncivilized, unsettled space, and now we've determined it as settled. So some things for us to keep in mind as we continue to chat through our conversation today. I also want to bring in, before I talk about my research, is my own positionality as a researcher. I began as an objective researcher, really focusing on a lot of statistical analyses, multivariate statistics, and they're very valuable in much of the work that we do. But when I was starting to research multicultural communities and multi-ethnic festivals, I found that it wasn't helping me get at some of those deeper meanings. So I really turned and became more of a subjective researcher, focusing more on that interpretivist epistemology. I also follow humanistic phenomenology, which values that each one of us is able to interpret our own experience, and that we value those experiences as being authentic and genuine and real. And finally, always remembering to remain critical as a researcher, understanding those power dynamics that are at play continuously in our everyday experience and how they shape us in our everyday lives. And of course, always being reflexive as to my role in the research process. I also want to bring in kind of a play on words. We talk a lot in our society today about how important social media is and the media influencers in our lives. And I just want to have a little play on that for today and say that certainly there were several seminal tourism researchers that have influenced me and continue to do so as I, continue my lifelong journey reading tourism and all the work that these researchers have done. But I also try to ground myself in these radical philosophers and change makers and action-oriented individuals of the past who really broke through those norms and structures of our society. I also want to bring in some seminal geography researchers, Yifu Tuan and Edward Ralph, who really changed the way we view geography back in the early 1970s. So that's just a little bit of grounding for our discussion today. So bringing in this geography, and it's so exciting to have people be as excited about geography as I am. So thank you for that, Sonia. I'm going to be talking about two sort of main realms of geographic framing, I guess you could say, for that has underscored my research over the last little while. And the first is sensuous geographies. In the early 1970s, as I mentioned, Tuan and Ralph and Lynch and others really turned the way we view geography at the time, which was very objectivist research based on our behaviors in different spaces, talked about location-based characteristics, and instead they focused more on our senses and how we see, feel, smell, and hear, and how we use those sensory cues in different spaces to really understand and interact with different spaces and places. Rodaway took that a step further and explored in great detail how we can use those particular senses in our perception of the world around us to really get a greater understanding of how we're situated, both at the individual and social levels in different historical, technological, and cultural contexts. And sensuous geographies really allow us to get a more intimate geography with knowing the world around us and connecting us with the present and the past and the future. I also want to bring in emotional geographies, and this emotional turn in geography occurred just a little bit later, and it's this notion that we are engaged as humans with the world around us, cultural places, intangible culture, our emotions, and sensory encounters we have with different places. It's a geography that connects us in terms of these and charters these sensory attachments and affective responses to place. And there's many different aspects that connect our emotions to places: oral traditions, relationships, kinship, our morals and ethics, the narratives and stories we tell, our daily lives and rituals. And not only on that point that I just addressed, but that it privileges these, and it says that we are able to hold them accountable, or that we are accountable to these emotions in our places, and that we have to value them as being authentic and very powerful. So I'm going to come in and bring in a little bit of Kai Miller's poetry again, just to have us continue to think about these big ideas today as I talk about my research. What the map maker ought to know is a poem by Kai Miller, which is the dialogue between the local or the rastaman and the cartographer or the map maker, or in our discussion today, the tourism developer. No matter how hard you try to alter place, it shifts and it moves, as Kai Miller states. It's impossible to control. On this island, things fidget, Kai Miller says. Whole places will slip out from your grip. So as tourism managers, researchers, developers, I think we try to plan and manage tourism in a way perhaps not realizing that places are continuously shifting, and we have to renegotiate those place meanings continuously as they evolve and shift around us. And from that, I'm going to continue and start in with kind of one of the research areas that I've been very familiar with, and that's multi-ethnic festival experiences. So this research I want to talk about is work that I've been doing with multicultural and multi-ethnic festivals. I researched festivals in urban centers, Waterloo, Mississauga. I did some early work in Toronto many moons ago, but most of my research has been in what we call heterolocal socio-spatial settlements. And it consists of 5 major attributes. So a heterolocal sociospatial settlement is where migrants settle in a new community, but they are dispersed sort of equally spatially within the community. Their place of residence is not necessarily close by their place of work, and they may not live close to other residents who are of the same ethnicity as they are. This differs from, say, our distinct ethnic neighborhoods in, say, downtown Toronto, for example. They're also spatially differentiated with regards to where they decide to go shopping and where they may have their other, cultural institutions and so on. Yet strong ethnic community ties do exist in these communities. And certainly 21st century communications and technology and mobility access has enabled these strong ethnic ties to continue. So in this particular research, I interviewed ethnocultural group organizations. So the leaders of ethnocultural group organizations as non-for-profit organizations. So say the Islamic Association of Kitchener-Waterloo or the Greek Orthodox community and so on and so forth. I interviewed approximately 30 festival participants, and I call them participants because they were the ones who organized their own pavilions, their own booths. They participated in the dances, they organized what food they were going to share, and they were really part of the organization of their own cultural group at the festival. I started out with semi-structured interviews, and they last about 40 to 50 minutes. And as I was interviewing, I realized that they were becoming more of a narrative story and really adapted and adopted a narrative approach to this research. Narratives allowing them to talk more about their individual experiences and the group dynamics, as well as engage with more of their everyday experiences, not just in association with the festival. It allowed me to collect very rich data about their experiences and also allowed me to devise a multicultural research framework from this particular study. So what themes emerged from this particular work? It was very, very, very deep and very heavy and tied very much with our emotional geographies of place and certainly our senses as well. And one of the first themes related specifically at an individual level in association with senses, emotions, and the body. So participating in the festival was only one small component, but it was the preparation and the work leading up to the festival that also contributed. So the tactile response of making and preparing food, the feeling of wearing costumes and clothing for traditional dances, the way the body moves in these familiar ways in association with their culture. It was an identity creating exercise, and it allowed them to connect with who they are. Another theme that emerged in this research was associated with family and sense of belonging and identity. And the festival space allowed migrants to continue to share these pieces of their culture with each other, with their family members, and rekindle these notions of identity and place identity with their country of origin. Doreen Massey, a seminal geographer, talks about places being made up of flows and movements, and that we have to look beyond just these bounded spaces with boundaries and borders to open up these perspectives on what place means, especially for migrants. And she talks about this as a global sense of place. Alternatively, Castells talks about space of flows, and these festivals really act like a space of flow, allowing culture to move between groups and between individuals and allow them to negotiate place meanings among each other and among places, the community that they live in currently, as well as their country of origin that they're connecting to. The festival in these particular instances created an open, welcome space for them to share the culture that they would want to in their own terms. And finally, these festivals allow for place and place sharing. So in everyday life, we choose to connect ourselves with everyday habits, the way we cook, what we wear, where we go, who we socialize with. And in this particular instance, it allowed these migrants to continue to connect with these daily habits that related to their culture, that perhaps they may not do in the every day, but continuously come back to when they prepare themselves and participate in the festival. And it's also a place sharing where they feel that they can connect with their community members as well as other residents in the community with regards to this culture, wishing to share on their own terms, whether it's more contemporary aspects of their culture or more traditional aspects. So when we talk about the meaning of festivals for migrant communities in particular, it does require this retelling of the migrant story. And in a terminology that I adopted from Wise titled Sensuous Multiculturalism, doesn't that sound wonderful? She concentrates on sight, smell, our tactile response, and sound. But what differs from Wise's work, where she was working with one ethnic group at a time, a multicultural festival space allows for many groups to be intertwined and connected together in a concept of place sharing, and that there's ties between these groups, and festivals allow these ties to continue and to be negotiated through different spaces and times. So multicultural festivals really provide this opportunity for place sharing as well as place making. Previous research has perhaps talked about festivals as not necessarily developing a strong sense of place for the community with which they live at the time. But in this particular instance, it was not necessarily sense of place or placemaking for this community of, say, Kitchener-Waterloo, but of the country of origin or the place where their family has come from, that it was a way to rekindle a place identity for somewhere that was far away. And also it allows for them to have this sensuous geographical experience within this festival space and share their culture in an open, welcome environment, hence the term multiculturalism. So to kind of bring this research out into the forefront of where we are now with the importance of multicultural festivals, of course, through the pandemic, we're just starting to open up our spaces to festivals once again, and there'll be a greater need to visit multi-ethnic festivals now and in the future, and support these ethnocultural community organizations where these festivals are the primary way that they fund and make money for their non-for-profit organizations. Open gate free festivals are extremely important for these communities in developing a sense of place, sense of community, and continuously, identifying with their culture and a place far away. There are politics in the festival space and dynamics that do occur that challenge these groups through the festival, organization process. But the importance of these festivals and reaffirming a sense of place and identity for migrant communities is so very important. So we need to get out there and be at these festivals in our urban centers and rural and so on. There are deeper meanings of festivals for migrant communities, and increasingly the role of placemaking for festivals is very, very important, especially for first-generation Canadians and newly settled migrants. So that was some of my research that I did on multicultural festivals. And I had a deep, deep interest in the migrant experience, having spoken to and learned so much from my research participants. And I wanted to continue on that research in festivals, but with specific constraints. I started to become very fascinated with migrant family travel, having worked in low-income, migrant-heavy communities. I started to notice that there was a deep desire for migrants to travel to their countries of origin. And my family, my children are half first-generation Canadian, and I could see that there was a deep desire for my own children to travel back to a country of origin for themselves. And so I sort of emerged from festival research into sort of engaging with this deeper migrant travel experience. I adopted research and literature from transnational studies. And while transnational studies have focused on migration and the movement of new migrants to new communities, and talk about family travel in terms of multi-generations and first and second generation migrants, what was missing from that research were the factors that related to tourism. So tourism-related phenomena, the concept of the return trip home, and the educative properties of travel for migrants. Despite numerous studies that currently exist on the role of children in travel, or the absence or presence of children and the role of children in tourism to begin with, it's a really current topic right now. There is still a lack of understanding or little research on the role of travel for migrant families. And so it's still really a current topic. So in this particular research, I adapted a mobilities paradigm. So mobilities paradigm being one where we engage with the movement of people and the flows of ideas and culture, and align with the everyday experience and flows that occur, and how this influences tourism and travel. And in this particular case, it was certainly less structured, engages with more informal research processes and more active research. So the researchee becomes more of an active participant, and there's more of a blurring between the subject and the participant, and so on. So in this particular research, I focused on multi-generational migrant family travel. And in it, engaged with very deep relationships between the travel experience itself and family dynamics, being a very multi-generational experience. In this research, I found that the primary motivation for traveling back to the country of origin or to the homeland was learning, not just learning about their own culture or cultural heritage, but even learning about certainly the place with which their family has come from, and learning with regards to family members they've heard about in stories but have never yet met. That was certainly the case with my own children. And this learning happens in very intimate settings and spaces. So in familial homes or in places of important cultural heritage or religious meaning. So very deep in terms of these intimate and emotional connections to place. And certainly there's a deep investment for migrants in family travel. And it's been shown to enhance family bonds, escape the pressures of everyday life, and it's valued in terms of its role in contributing to family togetherness. Family travel back home for migrants has very deep meanings, and perhaps deeper than other family travel experiences. And it certainly is very important for migrants in Canada, first generation Canadians, and equally so, it's important for those family members back in the country of origin who want to see how the next generation is doing and what those experiences were like. And having them return back is a deeply emotional experience for all family members. So I'm going to bring in once again this notion of the metaphor. And it relates to my research on multi-ethnic festivals and migrant family travel. You'll see there on the one side is some petite madeleines. Those are actually ones that I baked myself. And on the other is, of course, Marcel Proust. La Madeleine de Proust has become a fairly common expression in the French language. And a research note by Serafin in 2021 talked about this unconscious memory resurfacing in strong and irrational ways. It refers to a passage in Monsieur Marcel Proust's 7-volume novel, À la recherche du temps perdu, or In Search of Lost Time. The narrator examines the notion of involuntary memory, a conception of human memory in which cues are altered or encountered in our everyday life. So like enjoying a petite madeleine with a cup of tea, that immediate reaction and expression that happens in our unconscious memory is extremely powerful and strong, and it takes us back to a place or a situation where we've been before. The scent of something, the taste of something, seeing something again. For a migrant, this is extremely powerful. You may live, decades abroad or only travel back to your country of origin a few times, but that immediate attack of a memory can occur at any time. And it's less unexpected for those who do go back more often. But that experience is really important for us to connect with as tourism researchers, that these aspects of place that are deeply emotional and sensuous come back to us. And it's very important for those migrants traveling back to their countries of origin. So bringing this research to the forefront of presently and what we really need to focus on as tourism researchers. And there is a deep need for migrants to connect with family overseas now more than ever in our post-pandemic, if I use that phrase lightly, era, where there hasn't been the ability to travel back to their countries of origin Migrant family travel will predictably be greater, and we need to be aware of that greater demand. Migrant family travel is deeply emotional, and there is a deep sensuous connection to place, and those places that are certainly far away and that they are unable to connect to on a daily basis. We also need to be aware in the domestic tourism sector of the need for migrants to travel internationally. And perhaps our focus in the domestic sector is on shorter trips for newcomers or migrant Canadians, as their needs may be for long haul international trips. There is a need for migrants to travel internationally. Therefore, there is a lack of discretionary income. These trips are very expensive, and they often consist of multi-generations. So they're sending a number of family members on these trips to begin with. We also need to remap the landscape of family travel in Canada. We often presume or focus our domestic travel on and our international travel on prime Christian holidays such as Christmas and Easter, and our school breaks such as March break and summertime. But for migrants, these aren't ideal times for travel. They may need to, especially if they're visiting Africa or the Middle East or Southeast Asia, they may need to travel during, say, the dry season, or what we would term the off season, or when there are cheaper flight times. And it also means that it's during their own holiday times. Yet our settler colonial structures here in Canada tend to discount the need and importance for migrants to travel at these other times of the year. And how important these are for our migrants in our communities, our very diverse communities, in terms of their identity constructions, in terms of their well-being, and in terms of how they educate their youth. We bring back those storytelling metaphors from our Indigenous communities that I spoke to in the beginning. So that was my work on the migrant travel experience. Now, we all experience constraints in our daily lives, and I've certainly experienced constraints in my own research in being able to or unable to continue on with different studies. And I still have a fascination with migrant family travel and have lots of potential research ideas out there, but I started to focus on storytelling and remapping and retelling stories in a different way. Again, still focusing on those stories that relate to diversity, but I turned sort of more inward, focusing on women's travel narratives. And this is where I went to next. These were highly emotional and sensuous stories, and stories certainly are very emotional and very sensuous. And yet, when we think about, say, travel books or travel memoirs, which these were travel books and narratives about Paris in particular, they extend beyond what we negotiate or think to be a scholarly message, say. They convey news, gossip, shared cultural experiences of a particular time and a particular place. They perhaps are unconventional tourism texts or a research text, if you may, but are immensely valuable in understanding what place means for travelers. So these particular narratives certainly convey deep meanings and values, and they are descriptions that assign attributes to particular people and places that are involved in them. Women's travel has interested tourism researchers for quite some time, focusing on sensuality, embodiment, and experience. But little attention has been paid to women's travel experiences specifically in relation to place. And that's what I was focusing on with this particular research. I used a methodology here that is perhaps not as conventional in tourism. It was hermeneutic phenomenology, which is situated in or has a history in the reading of religious texts. And what essentially it does is it is a reading of a text whereby you take phrases or words or ideas or themes and situate them within the socio-political and cultural context with which they were written. So I read over 25 travel books by women authors of their travel experiences in Paris in the post-1990 era. Now, I bring up this slide here about feminism. I'm certainly not about to go into a very detailed account of the different waves of feminism here, but I want to allude to the third wave feminism, alternatively called post-structuralist feminism, because this is really where these texts were situated in the sociocultural context. Third wave feminism differs from the previous waves in that it associated itself more in popular culture and media. And when we think about the adolescents or our young adults whose mothers were situated in previous feminist waves, they had a different experience. So third wave feminism is more opened up to understanding diversities of feminism, the intersectionalities of feminism, as well as, understanding ethnic diversity and, the reclamation of, say, derogatory terminology, or the acceptance of how we display our femininity in society and in popular culture. Also believing in equity and diversity, but also embracing what we would term traditional feminist qualities. And this is where I framed this literature that I was engaging with here. What was fascinating about this research that engaged with storytelling about place was that they were deeply interconnected with sensuous geographies. So yes, we know that there are, hundreds of travel texts and travel memoirs. These in particular were deeply sensuous accounts of Paris. Women were writing about their sights, sounds, and smells, their tastes, but not all of them were positive. When we think about how we market places for tourism, we're very aware of promoting the positive aspects of place. And yet these accounts weren't always positive, and yet they were deeply sensuous, and there was a deep connection and attachment to place for these women. In this particular excerpt here, it talks about the sights, the clay pots, the wrought iron balconies, the connection to the sidewalk, and the sudsy water being cleaned, and the smell of bread baking, and so on. What was quite profound about these texts and how they related to tourism were these accounts weren't grandiose experiences of attractions that these flagship attractions that we hear so much about, but they were everyday mundane descriptions of simple activities, and this is what connected these women to Paris. In addition to that, these were very deeply emotional geographies tied to place. So certainly these accounts dealt with freedom and self-identity. So the ability for travel to connect with a sense of freedom and to build who we are in terms of our identity. But unlike other research on the transformative properties of tourism and travel, for women travelers, these weren't all solo travelers or young adults, but these were women of various ages and stages in their life, whether it was widowed or divorced, with children, without children, young adults. It was very, very diverse in terms of their demographic in that sense. In this particular excerpt here by Cathy Martin, she talks about it being an extremely emotional connection with Paris after her husband passes away. She's, locked herself in a bathroom and she's crying, and she knows the only place where she can go is Paris. It's been her one fixed point. So how do we bring this notion of storytelling and these emotional and geographies and sensuous connections to place back out in the forefront and connect us to more current research in terms of women's travel? There are certainly specific meanings that women tie to place, and we need to continue to remap those and renegotiate what those meanings are. It's never been more true than in the post-pandemic era, where we've heard many stories and accounts of women, and especially marginalized women, becoming increasingly marginalized through the pandemic era. And understanding the role of travel for women currently and in the future is never more important than now. There will be a resurgence perhaps for women's travel in the future. And we've seen a lot of promotional activity on re-engaging with those girls' trips. But travel may need to be adjusted and reconsidered for women in terms of relating to more mental health and well-being, focusing on these deeper connections of women with other women, those that they have intimate relationships with, and retelling the role of travel for women in terms over time, and renegotiate the meaning of travel for women over time. And of course, which we're already engaging with in scholarly literature, is the need for diverse stories, those of different ethnic backgrounds and those in our LGBTQ community. So we're seeing much more of that happening currently, and that's wonderful to see. So again, to bring in this idea of Kai Miller's poetry, in which the cartographer explains himself, the cartographer being that map maker or tourism developer or manager. And in this particular excerpt, we believe, I think, as tourism researchers and managers and planners, and like the settler or like the colonial, that we're doing the best we can. And they explain that, but to imagine what loss might be like in these places, consulting with the world around us, the trees and the fences and whatever might prove to be a landmark. The cartographer talks about his job being, to widen these areas and spaces, to untangle the tangled, and, to unworry the concerned, and pull you out of these cul-de-sacs with which you have wrongly turned. But what if being tangled is the way it's supposed to be? What if we're not supposed to untangle? And what if, those that we think they're concerned about, what if they're not concerned about that at all? And there is other deeply more ingrained concerns. And what if going the wrong way or turning down a way that's wrongly turned, maybe it is the right way after all? So some deeper things to think about, I think. And yet, as Kai Miller talks about in his poetry, in which the Rastaman disagrees with that, well, but what you actually do is that you take these things and you thin them out and you make them invisible and witless, and then you make these other things visible that should have never existed in the first place. And I think that those metaphors and those bigger ideas need to always come back to get us thinking about what should exist, what shouldn't exist, and what are we making visible, and yet what are we keeping invisible? So this leads me into sort of another research area where I was looking at narratives and storytelling, and I focused here on media narratives. We all went through a bit of a transition phase, I think, through the pandemic, and we can't discount the role it had in shaping who we are in our own identities as researchers. And I began to question the way travel and tourism was being portrayed through the media. I specifically was looking at Canadian online news media and how it was framing travel and tourism. I focused here again, as I mentioned, on Canadian online news media and the way they portray travel and domestic travel throughout the pandemic. If you look at these two articles here, we talk about the way media can shape the way we think, and we talk about the way they share stories and get us thinking about how we're supposed to read these stories. So in the one headline on it's my left, where it talks about 6 safer expert-backed vacation ideas, the story there is framed in a way that says that we can travel safely during the pandemic, we just have to be careful. On the other side, is it safe to travel? We might need to consider canceling plans. That story is framed in such a way that creates this theme that travel is unsafe. So that's kind of what I was looking at, the way the media shares these stories about travel. And so in this particular research, I focused on discourse analysis. Discourse analysis has been applied quite steadily in tourism research since 2011, since about that critical turn in tourism studies. And it's a great way, a practical tool to analyze power constructions. There are various media forms that have been applied in tourism. Newspapers, websites, travel blogs, commercials have been applied in tourism research addressing the socio-political issues within specific areas of tourism. This study, as mentioned, emphasized online news media and conceptualized the discourses present within travel and tourism and during COVID-19. So I looked at several articles, oh gosh, I think there's 90 in total, and I think 65 of them I was able to narrow it down. And interestingly enough, the articles and the media narratives situated itself in a particular discourse, a discourse of fear. And this is what Alteed talks about as being a problem frame. So news media renegotiate and circle that problem frame throughout the course of the issue and continuously emerge this discourse of fear. If they notice that, you know, people are not as concerned or not as afraid anymore, they'll reemerge that discourse through headlines and stories that continue the problem frame. So some of the themes that emerged in this research were about antitrust, anxiety, and the avoidance of travel. So there's some really great themes and discussion points with that research. But what I want to focus on in this presentation specifically is that in that research, there is a need to retell the hidden discourses through that analysis of media. And primarily what was hidden were those struggles, the silent struggles of those that worked tirelessly in the tourism and hospitality sectors throughout the pandemic to renegotiate and readjust and deal with all the discrepancies and inconsistencies with travel restrictions and health and safety protocols. There was also a lack of reporting on the safety of travel and hospitality sectors and how safe they actually were. And also, you know, the true authentic statistics and probabilities of risk associated with travel. And also silencing those power dynamics between scientists and policymakers and those in the travel and tourism sector. So a very fascinating research project in that sense. And that leaves me to where I am now with my research. And this is a very new project that I'm working on, and it's still in the very exploratory stages. But I've decided to take this idea of sensuous and emotional geographies and think about it in terms of very deeply intrinsic values of tourism in communities. And I'm focusing now on creative tourism, and I'll loosely say it's a subset of cultural tourism in a way that is more deeply intrinsic and connected to a community, as opposed to, say, mass cultural tourism. It is inherently connected to placemaking and the building of sense of place and belonging. And what it does is it helps communities, you know, make places. It talks about it focuses on incremental community building, and it allows the creative arts to be a component of the tourism mix in a community. So creative arts, we know, provides a voice for locals. It also provides or allows silences in those marginalized communities. It allows those silences to emerge. Creative arts allows community building, and it provides a sense of place and identity for those living in a community. So my question is, how can we embrace that and further stimulate those feelings and use that for tourism regeneration? Creative tourism has regenerative properties, and there are certainly very deep, meaningful, intangible, and tangible cultural experiences associated with the creative arts. So some of my focus is looking at street art and creative industries in downtown Toronto and the role that, you know, are ethnic community and our creative arts in those different ethnic communities can help regenerate tourism in some of these spaces. I am also looking at the role of creative industries and creative arts in the Caribbean and focusing on the Bahamas. And as mentioned, I'm in the beginning stages of that research, finding already how deeply emotional and sensuous this is for the locals and how passionate they are to bring the arts forward for tourism. So bringing back Kai Miller, and it's very fitting that a lot of his poetry connects so deeply with the way my research is evolving now in terms of the creative arts. The cartographer says in response to the Rastaman, no, what I do is science. I show the earth as it is without bias. I never fall in love. I never get involved with the muddy affairs of land. Too much passion unsteadies the hand. And yet, in my research, speaking with non-for-profit community organizations, speaking with locals who are really trying to maintain their sense of identity through their culture, there's nothing but passion, and there's nothing but love, and the affairs of the land are muddy. And I think we have to remember that in the tradition of the settler colonial and the tourism developer, that we've tried our best to be the objective and not get emotional, and yet places are tied deeply with emotion and senses, and not to forget the passion. The Rastaman thinks, well, draw me a map. Draw me a map of what you see, and I'll draw you a map of what you never see. And whose map will have the bigger value? Whose map will show the larger truth? And that's kind of what I wanted to weave through today, is that what are we showing? Whose truth are we mapping, and whose stories hold the larger truth? And how can we really deeply engage with that and be passionate about it in the work that we do? So as I mentioned, my current project that I'm just beginning to address and finding some, themes emerging, talks about the emotional and sensuous geographies of these deeper stories of place and the placemaking potentials of the creative arts to contribute to regenerative tourism in spaces that have been traditionally influenced by neocolonial touristic processes. Example, mass tourism. This artwork that I show here on this slide is from an artist whose work is displayed in the National Art Gallery of Bahamas in Nassau. And as you can see, just by this one simple piece of artwork, it shows a local story of tourism. You see the local youth there with their ghetto blaster on one side of the chain link fence, and the tourist objects on the other side, making us think a little bit more deeply just in this one piece of art about that tourist local divide, the privileged access to the beach area, and the haves and the have-nots. And I just want to bring in these two quotations here just to realign ourselves with these bigger ideas in tourism research. We've heard, I'm sure, through our various social media circles about this phenomenal film that has come out, and I hope to see soon, The Last Tourist. And in that, there's the quotation, tourism can kill a place. A place that was so beautiful can become overused, exploited, and trashed. Mass tourism has led to destruction of the very thing they have come to see. Yet when I was doing my master's research, and I was doing some work many moons ago in the late 1990s on a small tourist community here in Southern Ontario called St. Jacobs, came across this research by Fred Doms, who published a paper in 1991. If we're not careful, we could kill the goose that lays the golden egg. Interestingly enough, it's 30 years previous to this documentary. So I really hope that we continue to retell and revisit and remap these perceptions and feelings and realizations about tourism, so that perhaps we can more deeply engage with some of these issues that have continued to resurface and resurface. Oh, sorry, I went a little bit quick there. I'm just about done. So to end, I just want to say that, you know, I'm very passionate about many things through tourism, and we're making wonderful progress engaging with storytelling and community building through tourism, and looking to a positive future with community festivals, increasing our understanding of diverse narratives in tourism in various tourism contexts, including regenerative processes, engaging with you know, Indigenous communities in tourism. But one thing to kind of, I think, remember is that we have to be careful in superimposing stories on top of others. And if I can just use one more metaphor here, I like to think about growing a garden or planting a seed. And we can't really pour more topsoil on top of old topsoil and expect new seeds to grow. That soil underneath, we have to figure out what's it made of. Can it actually grow the seeds that you want to plant? So I'd like to think of that in terms of tourism. Can we manage or plan or grow tourism in specific soils, if you will? Is that soil healthy? Has it been contaminated? And find out what are those components that make up that soil. And can the right tourism thrive in our particular destinations? And back to the metaphor of the turtle. What stories do we want to teach our youth? What stories do we want to be those new creation stories that truly acknowledge our identities, our diverse identities? And back to the metaphors of Kai Miller's poetry. What maps are being drawn in our tourism communities and our communities in general? Whose maps do we continue to draw? And how do we remap these places and spaces for tourism? And my final slide here just shows the same lake. This is Cypress Lake in Bruce Peninsula National Park. And one is the sunrise and one is the sunset. Two different perspectives, but the same place. So I kind of always want us to remember that there are various perspectives and identities associated with places. And finally, I'd like us to all be sure that we understand the value in finding our own Madeleine de Proust. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kelley. That was a lot of fun hearing about the different research that you've done over the years. I especially love the one related to women's stories because that resonates a lot with a lot of things that I've been thinking about. Brandon, who I think had to leave, said he's loving this chat and thank you. We need more scholars like Dr. McClinchey, which I thought was a very nice thing to say. He did have a question, which I'll ask for him. So is there anything on the role of festivals in creating a sense of place for those who are involuntarily displaced? If so, does it change, alter how place and festivals and tourism spaces and newly Canadian identities is constructed or known, including those that can no longer travel back to their homes?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So if Brandon does hear this afterwards, I'll say that's a great question. As mentioned when I talked about sort of the politics in festival spaces, that newly dispersed or I would say displaced migrants, the role of the festival is, I would say, even more important or increasingly important for them to build and make a connection with their community members. We do a very good job. We do a pretty decent job in terms of our settlement processes and welcoming newcomers and getting them situated. But where we're missing that is in the connection to their recreation and leisure, and in these festivals in particular, and making sure they find these connections and their community members. So there's still a lot of work to be done in that way. Not being able to return to the country of origin is extremely common in our new migrants and our newcomers to Canada. And to reinforce those place identities through festivals is extremely important. And having spoken to ethnocultural group organizers who hadn't, in some cases, ever been back to the country of origin, it was not necessarily an association with place in that instance, but culture and connection and sort of an idea of a place as opposed to a concrete place experience. And that's why I alluded to the opening up of how we understand place by Doreen Massey and Castells, so that this global sense of place or a space of flows, and renegotiate that understanding of place. So in that sense, again, the politics of festival spaces and the funding opportunities and the outreach to connect with ethnic migrants in these communities is really, really important. And it's an ongoing process that requires, once again, very passionate community members to continue that engagement. So I think I answered all the parts of Brandon's question.
Great, thank you. Tian Yun is asking a question. He's working on his master's right now, and he's looking at a particular approach to, well, I'll read what he says. As I'm working on finding hotspots and sacred places that are valuable to Indigenous peoples, to hopefully develop a better Indigenous tourism development plan, I'm wondering how you would, or what you would do to identify these spots. I guess he's asking, he wants to use an approach asking residents to identify sacred spots, sacred places, using a pin approach on a map. And I think he wants to know, have you ever used that approach? Have you ever, used something like that approach? Would you suggest something different in terms of identifying places that are emotionally sacred to people?
That's a really good question. I haven't used an approach such as that, but depending on the type of map being used, I think the type of map is very, very important. And oftentimes in different cultures, and I can't speak specifically to a specific Indigenous culture, but it's less about sort of a tangible map, so to speak, or a settler colonial created map as a description of a place, and perhaps the story behind that place, and engaging with the meanings behind it. So in that sense, and is it a space or is it a sacred space that that to understand if sharing and talking about that place is something that community also wants to engage with, and it's, I think, getting behind the story and talking about that place, and then figuring out the descriptions of that place through that story is very helpful. And depending on what kind of map, as I said, is used, that really more deeply connects that culture with that place, because various maps, again, will display different tangible locations based on that. So it's a really good question, and I haven't used that specifically, but I know that in talking with different ethnic communities and spaces, that we value locations differently, whereas in some of settler colonial cultures, we value like coordinates and an exact specific location to something, and I need to map that out with my GPS, and it's different in different cultures. That it's about, oh, it's beside the tree that's along the river and there is a bush there, and and so that is how we engage with that as that culture, I think, is underlying where we find it or know where it is.
Mm-hmm. No, that's an excellent point, for sure, because you're right. I think we have to also think about how we approach something like that, and also what is sacred to one person might belong to a story, or a story from an ancestor, and that might not be sacred to the community as a whole. But more often than not, in Indigenous cultures, yes, it is, you know, down the river by a bush versus, you know, written down. So it's a very good point. Great. Thank you so much. We are pretty much almost out of our time. That was really captivating, Kelley. I very much enjoyed it. And yes, I want to talk to you a bit about the women's work, because I think that that's really exciting and it's very interesting. So thank you so much for bringing your basically all the different elements of your research to our speaker series today. You have a very interesting way of, you know, taking this concept of space and place and, you know, how you study it in a variety of ways. So that was quite interesting. And also very unacademic to bring in all those beautiful quotes from people, which made it extremely interesting and a lot more personal, I think, you know, a lot more relatable to people versus just talking about other people's research or, you know, quoting.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, thank you so much, Sonia.
I really appreciated that. So the recording of this event, for those of you who want to see it, and Kelley, if you want to share it in your classes or share it amongst your network. A lot of times, you know, the time of may not have many people, but the after sharing, you know, a lot of people come to use these in their classes. So the recording of this event will be uploaded on YouTube by tonight. And please do share it with your network. And Parita has posted the link in the chat. And again, I just want to remind you all to find this and other speakers at htmresearch.ca. And again, Kelley, thank you so much for coming and joining us today and sharing your work with us. It was so interesting. I absolutely loved it. And I'm sure everyone who is going to watch it or has watched it today will as well. So we appreciate your time and hopefully we'll see you in person very soon.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sonia. And thank you everyone for watching. Thank you.